September 5th, 1921. A hotel room in San Francisco. There, in a haze of illegal boozing, we find a famous comedian and a screaming actress. 4 days later, she was gone, and the scandal was front-page news. Thus, the world cancelled its first celebrity. So, without further ado, let's start where most stories do. At the start. Who was Roscoe Arbuckle? Roscoe, who was also known by the very unflattering nickname Fatty, was definitely not lurking in the shadows of Hollywood. No, for many years he was at the very top of it. At his prime, even bigger than Charlie Chaplin. Very much an international superstar. He was born in 1887 in Kansas, and he arrived to the absolute terror of his very unfortunate mother, because he was indeed a very, very large baby, over 13 pounds. His father reportedly doubted that he was even his, and that rumor followed him through his childhood, and he never really felt accepted by his father or his family. But even despite all that, Roscoe would thrive and started performing. He would sing, dance, and leaned heavily into physical comedy. And he learned very early on how to make people laugh. So, by the 1910s, he was one of the biggest names in silent film. And a thing to note is that even though he was nicknamed Fatty, which studios really marketed heavily, colleagues often described him as surprisingly graceful, athletic, and well, light on his feet. And financially, he was untouchable. In 1921, he signed a contract worth $1 million a year, and that made him one of the highest paid entertainers in the world. So, with that, I just want to state that he was in no way, shape or form, when this happened, someone scrambling for some kind of relevance. He was at the very, very peak of Hollywood glory mountain, whatever you want to call it. Friends would describe him as shy off camera, and he wasn't known as a heavy drinker. He was also married, though that relationship was very strained at the time. He had wealth, status, and a kind of public image that studios carefully protected. His screen persona was clumsy, sweet, and ultimately completely harmless. And yeah, even so, that doesn't prove anything about what could actually have happened in that hotel room, but it sure complicates things, at least for the people watching from the outside. Because yeah, when the papers and the articles later would draw him up like some violent monster, it clashed entirely with how many had experienced him. One of his most famous movies is called Reckless Romeo, and it was actually even a hit over here in Sweden. And that just illustrates how much of a household name he actually was. But enough of that, let's move on to our leading lady. Who was Virginia Rappé? Virginia wasn't some random party guest who accidentally wandered into the wrong hotel room. No, she had been working for years to build a career in the early film industry. Born in Chicago 1891, her mother died when she was very young, and Virginia spent much of her childhood in foster care. And by her teens, she had started modeling, becoming sort of an it girl of her time, and eventually made her way into silent films, starting with smaller roles, fashion reels, and supporting appearances. Not a household name by any stretch like Roscoe, but she wasn't invisible. She was in the mix, maybe more locally. She was indeed trying her best. And by the year of the scandal in 1921, her career was kinda in a in-between stage. She hadn't yet become a major leading lady, but she had very steady work and plenty of connections. She moved in social circles that blended film people, society figures, and the wealthy elite. So being invited to a party hosted by one of the biggest stars in the world, that was an opportunity. Friends would describe her as warm and affectionate, but there was also consistent mentions of her health, such as reoccurring bladder infections, abdominal pain, and periods where she would become suddenly very ill. It wasn't a secret among some of her friends that she could go from perfectly fine to in a serious condition and discomfort very quickly. And that would actually become very important, because later that little piece of medical history would become part of the argument about what really happened that night in I'll just say room, because I don't know how to pronounce that properly, room 1219. And shortly after setting her foot inside of that party, her name would be on every front page in the US of A. The party. Arbuckle is in San Francisco for work. He and friends rent several rooms at the St. Francis Hotel. It's Labor Day weekend and prohibition was in full swing. Which of course means that alcohol was flowing freely and illegally. People would drift in and out of rooms, music plays, laughter spills into the hallways. It's chaotic, loud, and very indulgent. At some point that afternoon, Virginia ends up in Arbuckle's room. And now the timeline gets a bit murky, at best. Witnesses would say Arbuckle and Virginia went into a bedroom together. Some say the door was locked. And only minutes later, Virginia is heard screaming at the top of her lungs. And when the door opens, Arbuckle comes out in a pajamas and Virginia's hat on a jaunty angle. Whatever that means, like festive, I think. Virginia was found in the bed, struggling in agony, clawing at her clothes, foam coming out of her mouth, and some witnesses claim she cried out, "He hurt me." Others insist she blamed the alcohol. But one truth here is certain. She was half undressed, even though accounts differ if she undressed herself due to heat and illness, or if Roscoe was to blame there too. In short, there were many stories and they did not line up at all. But what we do know, she was placed in a bathtub to cool down. That was a common practice when someone had intoxication problems or hysteria, as it was called. Doctors were not called immediately. They just thought that they could whip her up in shape again when the alcohol got out of her system. But that decision would absolutely haunt everyone involved. Virginia is eventually taken to a hospital, and doctors discovered that her bladder had ruptured, which then had caused a severe infection in her abdominal cavity. And tragically, on September 9th, she moved on into early, dearly departure. And now, this illegal party became a huge national scandal. Enter Maud, a woman who was at the party and claimed to be a friend of Virginia. She told authorities that Arbuckle had assaulted Virginia, and others came forward claiming the same thing. They even said that Roscoe had used a Coke bottle to penetrate Virginia. The room was in utter chaos, and accusations hailed down without any real evidence to back them up. For example, it was first put forward that they had found Virginia's fingerprints intertangled with Roscoe's fingerprints around the door, as if she had tried to escape and Roscoe stopped her. But later these claims were debunked because maids had cleaned the room before any police officers had gotten to it, so no fingerprints had been collected. And then the whole Coke bottle story, well, that evolved into Roscoe using ice in her private parts, and then evolved even further away from the beginning that other partygoers had used ice on Virginia's body to wake her, in an attempt to wake her up. So it was like a game of telephone at this point. And yes, some accounts even further claimed that Roscoe had threatened to throw Virginia out the window if she didn't stop screaming. To absolutely no one's surprise, newspapers seized this story immediately. Article after article wallowed in the scandal, reporting every bit of juicy gossip. Headlines would describe a brutal attack. Some papers claim that Arbuckle crushed her with his weight. And with that, Roscoe's wholesome image was well and truly destroyed. Arbuckle was arrested for manslaughter. The public was furious and Hollywood terrified. The trials. The first trial ends in a hung jury. Most jurors favor acquittal. And the second trial also ends in a hung jury, but this time leaning towards conviction. The world was split down the middle about all this, but the third trial was different. After only a brief deliberation, the jury acquits Arbuckle. Not only that, they issue a written apology. They state there was not the slightest proof connecting him to a crime. Dear Maud, that we talked about earlier, never testified in court. Prosecutors decided that she was not reliable enough to put on the stand. Letters later surfaced suggesting she may have even been attempting to profit from the scandal. She was known in circles to be a person who would extort and blackmail people, so there's that. Medical testimony during the trials revealed no clear evidence of any sexual assault, no tearing, no definitive signs of crushing trauma. What they did find was several bruises on her arms and legs, and of course, the ruptured bladder. Doctors testified that Virginia had a history of such problems, and that a severely inflamed bladder could rupture under stress, especially if she was heavily drinking. So, what really happened? Modern historians generally agree that the prosecution's case was very weak and that the media coverage of the whole debacle was wildly sensationalized. And still, no one can seem to really agree about what happened that night in that room. And the people who would know, well, they're not even here today anymore, so. We can just ask ourselves, was this consensual intimacy that followed with a medical collapse? Was there some very rough handling that worsened an already existing condition? Or just a tragic medical emergency that turned into a whirlwind of scandal? And now, many years later, we will not have a forensic answer to this. The aftermath. Even though Arbuckle was acquitted, Hollywood banned him. His career never truly recovered. He would go on to direct movies under a fake name, since his own became shorthand for disgrace. Poor Virginia Rappé became frozen in time as a headline, either a martyr or a footnote, depending on who was telling the story. One life ended and one life unraveled, and the truth stayed. deep inside of that room. Some say that she's actually haunting us to this day, wandering around Hollywood Forever Cemetery. I think it's called that, yeah. Just unrestful and crying over the tragic ending of her blossoming career and life that was cut short. And even though the Jazz Age music is long gone, the room still stands. Room 1219. New guests sleep there. You could, if you want. But somewhere between all that screaming and the headlines, something, the truth, slipped far away from reality.